She heard them whispering again, but this time she didn't flinch. They thought she couldn't hear it, those low, mocking tones behind her back. Crybaby, weakling, too soft for war. But 22-year-old specialist Madison Reeves had learned to stay quiet, to let the weight of their doubt press against her spine like a second uniform. She didn't push back, not with words. She let her silence speak instead. What none of them knew, what not even Madison herself fully realized yet, was that in less than 24 hours, every whispered doubt would fall silent, and when that silence came, it would echo across a war-torn valley and upend everything they thought they knew about strength. For now, she sat in the corner of the barracks, cleaning her M249 with surgical precision for the third time that morning, not because it needed it, but because routine calmed the knot of frustration she'd been carrying in her chest since the morning briefing. "Wonder what set her off this time," Sergeant Torres muttered to Corporal Jackson as they passed. Madison didn't look up, didn't blink, didn't acknowledge. She could have explained it all, that her tears weren't weakness, that she cried because she felt everything, everyone, all at once. She could read a room before she walked into it. Feel danger coming like a change in air pressure. But explanations didn't matter out here. In a forward operating base tucked high in the Verde Valley, a strategic bottleneck in the border conflict, words got you nowhere. Only one thing counted: how cold you could stay when it all went to hell in Madison. She'd never been cold. She never wanted to be. She was trained for this, ranked top in marksmanship, knew every inch of the terrain, could strip and reassemble her weapon in under 10 seconds, blindfolded, but none of that mattered, not when. The thing they remembered most about her was that she'd cried during a war movie in the rec tent. Never mind that she hit every target in her first firefight. Never mind that she spotted an IED placement that saved the convoy. No one remembered that. They remembered the tears streaking down her face as she fired, precision wrapped in pain, heart hidden under a helmet. She stared across the compound now, eyes scanning the ridgeline. The sun was bright, too bright. It felt like a day trying too hard to be peaceful. She didn't know it yet, but somewhere in those ridges, scouts were watching, marking targets, setting in motion the siege that would put every ounce of her being to the test. But before the smoke, before the blood, before the impossible stand that would last 12 straight hours, there was the loneliness, the ache of being unseen, misread, boxed in. Captain Morrison had kept her in logistics, supply counts, equipment checks, safe jobs for emotional soldiers. He never said it out loud, but she heard it in his voice every time he passed her over for a real assignment. "You just need to toughen up a bit," he told her last month when she asked again to be placed in perimeter defense. What he meant was, "You're technically excellent, but I don't trust you when things get real." Madison nodded, took the assignment, said nothing, then went back to her quiet war, the one inside, because what they didn't see, what they refused to see, was that her tears weren't cracks. They were signals. Madison felt the heat before the flame, the tremor before the blast. She'd grown up with that awareness, could walk into a room and feel its tension like static on her skin. It made her good. Too good, maybe. But because she felt, they mistook her for fragile. And maybe the worst part wasn't the whispers or the assignments. It was that quiet, persistent doubt creeping into her own mind. Maybe they're right. Maybe I'll never be enough for them. That's why, after every shift, she snuck off to the old Cums bunker. It was a relic, cold, concrete, forgotten, but to Madison, it was her sanctuary, her forge, inside. She built something no one had asked her to build. Readiness. Not just drills or weapon routines, though she did those too. She practiced fighting while crying, breathing through panic, hearing screams in the recording she played while firing. And still hitting the mark, she mapped the terrain not just tactically, but psychologically marking spots where fear would grip a man hardest, where attackers would feel exposed, where defenders would feel courage stir. She trained in secret, because she had to, because they wouldn't let her prepare out loud. That night, under the low hum of the emergency lights, Madison sat cross-legged on the concrete floor. The maps she'd drawn were scattered around her. Arrows, timetables, fire arcs, all theoretical until tomorrow. Until the moment 200 fighters would descend upon their base like a storm of fire, and metal, until their escape routes turned into traps. And the only chance for survival lay in a plan no one had the imagination or the feeling to believe in. She didn't know all of that yet, but she felt something rising, something coming. She stood at the edge of the command tent, silent, still, invisible, just how they wanted her. It was 1,000 hours on Monday morning, and the routine briefing felt no different than the last 100. Captain Morrison ran through defensive updates. Like clockwork, patrol shifts were assigned, sectors covered, contingency plans reiterated. And just like every time before, Madison waited for her name, knowing exactly what it would be used for. "Reeves," Morrison finally said, not even glancing her way. "You're on equipment maintenance and supply prep. Check ammo counts. Confirm medkits. Be ready to move if we need to bug out." Again, her pen hovered just a moment too long. Over her notepad, her jaw clenched. Around her, the others barely noticed. Torres was already nodding along to his perimeter assignment. Jackson looked pleased to be handed the M240. Peterson joked with Rodriguez about who'd get the better. Vantage Point and Madison? She was assigned to count bullets. She stood when dismissed, steady, collected. But something churned beneath her ribcage. Not anger, not even shame. Something more complex. Resentment laced with clarity, because she knew now they weren't just doubting her. They were relieved to keep her out of harm's way. Easier to leave her behind than deal with the discomfort of wondering whether she'd break down at the worst moment. She caught Captain Morrison alone outside the tent, folding maps. "Sir," she began, "if the alert status is serious, I request reassignment to a defensive position." Morrison sighed. It was a tired sound, almost paternal. "Reeves, we've been over this. You're valuable in your current role. You know the inventory better than anyone." "My marksmanship is ranked top of the unit," she said. "I've logged more hours in simulation than. This isn't about scores." His voice hardened. "It's about predictability. You cry during movies, specialist. That's not a condemnation. It's a pattern. What happens when it's real blood, real casualties?" "It already has been," she whispered. "And I never failed you." Morrison didn't reply. That night, back in the bunker, Madison stared down at her hand-drawn maps. Her fingers hovered over the terrain she knew better than any chart ever. Issued by command, red arrows showed the ridge lines. Circles indicated likely approaches. Notes along the side read like battlefield poetry. Emotionally vulnerable zone. Attacker advantage. Line of sight to tower. Exposed, but intimidating, set. Charge here. Illusion of numbers. She traced the lines in silence. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she'd stopped waiting for permission. By the time suspicion found her, it was already too late to undo what she'd become. The rumors started with idle curiosity. "She spends a lot of time in that old Combs bunker," Davis had muttered during a shift change. "Always asking about backup radio channels. Doesn't that seem off?" Torres had brushed it off at first, but then came Chun, mentioning that Madison had been reviewing blast radius charts for mortar they didn't even have in stock. Another said she'd been spotted checking structural weaknesses in the towers. Supports, all of it innocent, all of it explainable, but in a place where everyone already believed you were unstable? Curiosity looked a lot like spying. By Thursday, Captain Morrison had heard enough. "She's a good tech," Torres told him, "but she's gathering intel in places she doesn't belong." "I don't know if it's sabotage or obsession," Morrison sighed. Or maybe it's just her trying too hard again. They called her in under the guise of a routine check-in, but she could feel it in the room-tight smiles. Long pauses, questions with barbed hooks. Why were you reviewing the antenna? Logs last week? Hayes from HQ asked. I was checking interference patterns. She answered. Steady. Could indicate hostile jamming. That's outside your scope, Morrison cut in. I thought we were all responsible for base readiness, she replied. Including electronic vulnerabilities. Torres leaned forward. Are you preparing for something, Reeves? Something you haven't told us? Madison stared at him, the weight of her silence pressing against the inside of her throat. She thought of the maps, the simulated firefights, the late nights rehearsing fear so she could act through it. And then, quietly, she lied, No, Sergeant. Just doing my job. She almost threw it all away, almost. The restrictions came down hard. No more accessing comms logs. No more visits to restricted areas. No more independent initiative, as they called it. She returned to her quarters with a duffel full of hand-drawn plans, psychological attack profiles, and route schematics. All of it now forbidden. All of it damning evidence if anyone chose to investigate further. She stared at the trash can, then at the papers. Then, something inside her shifted. Not defiance, conviction. She folded each page carefully, placing them in the hidden compartment. At the bottom of her pack, if nothing ever happened, no one would ever know. But if something did, then maybe, finally, she'd be ready. The sky was cloudless when she went to sleep that night. The kind of sky that had no idea a storm was coming. The first mortar hit at 063. By 0632, the sky was raining fire. Madison was restocking medical packs in the supply depot when the blast hit. The floor rippled beneath her boots, shelves rattled. An ammo crate cracked open like a broken ribcage. Dust fell from the ceiling in slow, drifting swirls. Then came the wail of the base alarm. She didn't freeze. She didn't flinch. She reached for her weapon with muscle memory burned into her bones. Slammed the cover shut on the ammo belt. Flipped. A radio to Emergency Channel 1. Phoenix Command to all personnel. We are under coordinated attack. Multiple mortar impacts. Estimated enemy strength. 150 to 200 fighters. Evacuation protocols now active. She blinked hard, forcing the ringing from her ears. Across the depots. Narrow window. She saw the ridge lines light up like 1,000 sparklers, muzzle flashes erupting in clusters. 3-0, 4 firing positions, possibly more. Her mind snapped into clarity. This wasn't random shelling. This was a full-scale attempt to erase them. A rush of boots outside, shouted orders, rushed equipment grabs. No one saw her slip into the corridor, leading toward the command tent. No one stopped her. Inside, Morrison was already coordinating the fallback. Torres was wounded shrapnel to the thigh. Peterson had blood running down his arm, but was still clinging to the comms terminal. Jackson yelled over the radio, reporting the east wall nearly breached. The enemy had surrounded them on 3 sides. Morrison's voice was calm, but his eyes were wide. Evacuate south through Mountain Trail. Bravo. Teams of 3, suppressive fire in waves. Use the terrain. It was the standard play. The right one, maybe. Unless... Sir, Madison said. She wasn't shouting, but somehow, her voice cut through the chaos like a shot. They're following us. The western escape route looks open, but it's too open. They're herding us like prey. Morrison didn't even look at her. Not now, Reeves. Focus on your station. Sir, the attack pattern isn't about taking the base. It's about eliminating survivors. We're being driven straight into an ambush. The only path they haven't covered is the hardest one, Bravo. That's the real exit. Another mortar blast rocked the building. Madison stumbled, but stayed standing. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear, from knowing, from feeling. They were walking into a trap, and no one was listening to the one soldier who'd seen it coming. They're trying to wipe out the whole garrison, she said, sharper. Now, no survivors. No reports. Just ashes. Torres looked up from where he was bandaging his own leg. Even if you're right, what does that change? They've got numbers. They've got firepower. The best we can do is retreat fast and pray someone makes it through. Madison looked out the shattered window and realized exactly what she needed to do. There were two options: follow orders or do what had to be done. She turned back to Morrison. "Sir, I can hold them. I need heavy weapons. Comes access and full permission to set charges on fallback lines." Morrison stared at her like she'd gone mad. "You're not holding anything." "Reeves, you're evacuating with the rest of us. I'm not leaving anyone behind. Especially not," he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. "Especially not the one who cries." Madison felt it. The moment that would define everything, she could let it go. Could follow the path laid out for her. Could climb that mountain with the others and spend the rest of her life wondering if she could have done more. Or she could stay, stand, break every rule they'd wrapped around her. Risk death, court-martial, oblivion, and maybe save everyone. She looked Morrison straight in the eyes. "If you won't approve it, sir, I'm informing you of my intent to disobey and proceed with defensive action anyway." The room went still. Even the radio seemed quieter for a heartbeat. Torres stopped wrapping his leg. Jackson turned from the window. No one laughed, because for the first time, they saw it. Not the tears, not the softness, but the steel Morrison's. Jaw clenched. "If you do this, Reeves, you're done. You'll be court-martialed if you survive." She nodded once. "Then I'll survive." And she turned toward the weapons locker. Her final words before they left were simple, unforgettable. "Get everyone out," she said, slinging the M240 over her shoulder. "Take the South Trail. I'll buy you every minute I can." Torres limped forward, pressed 3 extra belts of ammo into her hands. "You're crazy," he muttered. "But if this works, God help them. God help them anyway." Madison replied, already moving toward the tower. As her unit disappeared into the fog of chaos, she took a breath. 12 hours. 200. Enemies. 1 chance, no backup. No orders, no fear. She looked out at the ridgelines and waited for hell to arrive. She didn't wait for them to come to her. She made the first move. From the shadow of the eastern watchtower, Madison slid into position. The M240's weight pressed into her shoulder, but she barely noticed. Her hands moved with instinct chamber. Check, belt feed, range dial. The enemy was still advancing in scattered formation, confident, almost careless. Let them think that, she thought. Let them believe they've already won. She waited until the first cluster of fighters crested the nearest ridge silhouetted against the sun-like targets on a live-fire range. Then she pulled the trigger. A controlled burst 10 rounds. Low and deliberate, ripped across the ridge. Not enough to show panic. Not enough to show desperation. Just enough to suggest calm defenders were watching. Coordinated. Waiting. 2. Fighters dropped. The rest scattered. Exactly as she hoped. She shifted positions immediately, ducking through the maze of pre-planned movement routes she'd memorized over months in the comms bunker. Smoke grenades covered her transition, just as she'd trained. By the time she opened fire from position 250 meters west, the enemy thought they were dealing with at least 2 teams. Then came position 3, then 4. Each time, she altered. The rhythm, long bursts, short taps, false suppressive fire. She was painting a soundscape of confusion, forcing the attackers to question everything. How many were inside? Where were the real guns? Why was no one visible, yet fire came from every angle? She monitored their movements from the abandoned bunker, the same place they'd once accused her of snooping. Now it was her control room. And in it, she wasn't crying, she was calculating, but holding the line wasn't enough. She had to make them doubt. She tapped into the enemy's unsecured radio frequencies, ones she'd mapped during her inappropriate research sessions weeks before. Their voices crackled with tension. Sector 4's taking fire again. We Thought this was a supply outpost? Where's all this coming from? I counted at least 6 positions, maybe more. She clicked on her own mic, disguised her voice, and broadcast across the base's old internal speaker system. Phoenix Actual to Guardian teams. Enemy force confirmed Sector Bravo fallback. Holding air support ETA. 40 minutes, maintain fire discipline. She repeated it with just enough delay, switching between fake voices and subtle modulations. To any outsider listening in, it sounded like a coordinated defense complete with reinforcements, and just like that. They paused. In war, doubt is oxygen for the outnumbered. She was flooding their lungs with it, but doubt wasn't bulletproof, and fear, once born, had to be fed. By hour 3, the attackers had shifted tactics. They weren't charging anymore. They were probing carefully, anxiously, trying to locate weak spots. Madison gave them none. She had 12 fighting positions preset, 7 of them with full fields of fire. 5 of them rigged with decoys and noise distractions. 1 with pre-recorded radio chatter. And she kept moving, never staying more than 5 minutes in any spot. She wanted them to think they were being watched from every shadow. She wanted them to be afraid, because fear made people hesitate. And hesitation gave her unit time. But then came the hardest hour, the hour of the shakes. It started near hour 4. Her hands began to tremble, not from exhaustion, but from the crash of adrenaline finally hitting her bloodstream. Her breathing came faster, her vision narrowed, her mouth was dry. She dropped around trying to reload and cursed herself. Not now. Her body was panicking, but her mind wasn't. She remembered the drills, the simulations, the long nights in the bunker playing combat sounds while staring at pictures of battlefield injuries, training herself to stay steady while falling. Apart, she sat behind a rock wall, hand pressed to her heart, counting backwards from 10, not to calm herself, to anchor herself. Her emotions weren't an enemy. They were a signal. She was feeling everything, because everything mattered. She wasn't shutting it out. She was letting it in, and still, she stood by hour 5. She stopped being a soldier. She became a ghost. The enemy was now convinced the base had at least a full platoon, possibly more. Their own reports were confused, full of conflicting head counts and exaggerated encounters. 3 on the southern wall. No. 5 in the bunker. Someone's coordinating this. This isn't random. They were right. Someone was coordinating, but not 5. Not 3. Just one woman, crying silently as she laid another belt of ammunition beside a shattered wall. One woman, bleeding from a gash in her shoulder she hadn't even noticed yet. One woman who still heard Torres's voice in her head from months ago. She'd crack under pressure. She smiled bitterly. If this was cracking, then maybe more soldiers should break. At hour 6, she heard the word she'd been waiting for. Withdrawal. The enemy's radio traffic was frantic. Morale was slipping. They weren't retreating yet, but they were close, and she knew exactly how to break them. She activated the speaker system and played the distant sound of helicopter rotors recorded months ago from the landing pad. Then she looped a voice transmission. Overwatch to Phoenix Space Strike package inbound. Mark hostile positions. The fear was instant. Radio silence swept across enemy chatter. Then came a call she hadn't expected. We're falling back. Command says objectives no longer justify casualties. She crouched low behind position 9 and watched through her scope as the first groups began to scatter down the valley. They were leaving. They were actually leaving. Not because she'd killed them all, because she'd made them believe they couldn't win. Hour 7 began not with bullets but with silence. That's when she knew they were breaking. The smoke had started to thin. The gunfire had quieted. Madison crouched in the shadow of position 9, rifle across her lap, ears tuned to every rustle in the mountain breeze. That's when she heard it. Radio static, muted voices, hesitation. Confirmed defensive strength, actual numbers still unclear. Commander requesting re-evaluation of engagement value. The enemy wasn't regrouping. They were stalling. They were scared. She moved like a shadow across the base, slipping between ruined walls, stepping over debris and spent shells. Her boots were soaked in blood, not all of it hers. Her arm burned from the shrapnels. She hadn't stopped to bandage, but none of it mattered. She'd trained for this, not in the official drills, but in the darkness, alone. With noise blaring in her ears and fake casualties bleeding on her screens, training not to go numb, but to stay human. Now that humanity was her weapon, she reached the bunker, the heart of her deception, and turned fear into a broadcast. With trembling hands, she activated the equipment she'd hidden away. Untouched for months, a pair of field radios, 3 speakers she'd rigged into the corners of the base. The cracked microphone she'd modified to distort her voice. She broadcast to the enemy again. Calm, steady, inevitable. Command to all teams, reinforcements approaching from the East Ridge. Air support cleared for engagement in 10 minutes. Hold defensive positions and conserve fire. Then she switched channels, broadcast again. Guardian Squad. Report positions, Amos status. She changed her voice, modulated the tone. To the enemy, it would sound like a net filled with disciplined teams, coordinating a multi-front defense. In truth, it was all one voice, one woman, one heartbeat. Then came the hardest moment, knowing she could end it. And choosing not to. At position 11, she sighted a small group of retreating fighters. 5 men young, barely out of their teens. They were limping, bloodied, dropping gear to move faster. Their radio was still on. She could hear them pleading with their commander to abort the mission. She could have fired, could have taken them all out. But she didn't, because she wasn't here to kill them. She was here to break them, to make sure they'd never want to return. And as she watched one of them stop staring back toward the base, wide-eyed, muttering, "They've got air support," she realized he believed the lie more than she did. By hour 8, the retreat became collapse. She triggered the final illusion. Fake artillery strikes, pre-recorded explosions, timed with smoke grenades she'd placed at the ridgeline days ago. From the enemy's perspective, it was a full artillery barrage. To Madison, it was the last card, and it worked. Enemy comms lit up with panicked voices. "We're under fire. This isn't what Intel said. Retreat now, now." "They've got fire teams on every wall. We lost 8 trying to breach the west flank. Command ordered a tactical withdrawal. Repeat abandon objective." Madison slumped behind a half-collapsed barrier, exhaling for the first time in what felt like hours. She wasn't done, but she'd turned the tide. Hour 9 was pure madness. Not from them, from her. She laughed, not loudly, not giddily, but in a way that cracked under the weight of everything, because she could feel it. The fear, the unraveling. She'd spent her whole life drowning in emotion, and now finally she was using it to sink the enemy. She kept her ears to the radios, adjusting her deception with surgical precision, changing her tone, adding confusion. Sector 3, fall back to inner perimeter. All units, prepare for final counterstrike. She was pulling strings like a puppeteer, each phrase tailored to strike at their assumptions, their fatigue, their panic, and all the while, tears slid down her cheeks, not from fear, not from exhaustion, but from knowing finally that everything they'd ever called weakness was working. Hour 10 brought the first real quiet, and that terrified her. For the first time since the attack began, there were no gunshots, no radio calls, no screams, just the wind through shattered walls. She crawled to the upper platform of the comms bunker and looked through the scope. The hills were empty. No movement, no flashes, just smoke and trails of bodies, equipment discarded, crates left behind. She counted 7 wounded enemy fighters limping toward the northern ravine, and still no gunfire, no one to pull the trigger. She lowered the rifle and wept, because she was still alive. By hour 11, The story wrote itself into legend. She tuned into the enemy's final transmission. Abort operation. Phoenix base confirmed fortified. Resistance far exceeds projection. Casualties unsustainable. That was the moment. The exact second they surrendered the idea of victory. Not because they were outgunned, but because one woman had made them believe they were. She had 1 hour left until extraction. 1 hour until the helicopters arrived. She cleaned her rifle one last time, gathered her spent casings, and waited, surrounded by ghosts of the defense that never existed except in her voice, her tears, and her relentless, unwavering will. The rotor blades were still minutes away when the radio came alive, disbelief clinging to every word. Phoenix base, this is Overwatch Command. Confirm base status, repeat status, and defender count. Madison pressed the transmit key with fingers blackened by soot and blood. Her voice, cracked and raw from shouting over explosions, came out clear. Phoenix base secure. Enemy forces have withdrawn. Defensive positions intact. A pause. Understood. Confirm number of base defenders remaining. She looked around. Her at the 7 machine gun nests she had manned. The empty ammo belts piled like fallen branches. The smoke still curling from smoldering sandbags. She closed her eyes, then spoke. 1. Another pause. Longer this time. Please confirm. 1 defender. She repeated. Specialist Madison Reeves. Held the line for 12 hours. Silence. Then faintly, a second voice came through. Jesus Christ. She was still standing when they arrived, but barely. The first helicopter dropped onto the landing pad in a vortex of wind and grit. Madison watched it descend through narrowed eyes. Her legs shook, not from fear, but from everything her body had endured. The adrenaline had faded. All that was left now was the pain. Her shoulder throbbed with every breath. Her thighs were covered in bruises from diving behind cover. Her lips were split. Her back ached from dragging ammo crates alone, but her grip on the M240 never loosened. The ramp dropped, and Captain Morrison was the first to step out. He didn't shout, didn't run, just walked slowly toward the figure standing in the ashes of a siege. His face said everything. Disbelief, awe, and something else, guilt. He stopped 2 feet in front of her. Reeves. She didn't answer, just handed him her rifle, fingers reluctant to let go. His voice broke as he asked, how many? 30 confirmed dead, dozens more wounded. They retreated when they believed air support was inbound. You did this? She didn't nod, didn't claim it, just looked toward the ridge where the last of the enemy had vanished. Torres limped forward from the second bird. His eyes scanned the base at the scattered positions. The speaker wires, the spent shells at every angle. You convinced them this place was crawling with defenders. I convinced them attacking us wasn't worth it, Madison whispered. The next 48 hours were a blur of reports, cleanup, and questions, most of which couldn't be answered by doctrine. How did she do it? Was it luck? Where was this in her file? The after-action report was 29 pages long and read like fiction. Enemy forces estimated at 200. Defense mounted by 1. Casualties minimal, base intact, and the biggest mystery of all. How did one emotionally unstable soldier outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast an overwhelming force? They called her in for questioning the next morning, but not the suspicious kind anymore. This time, it was intelligence officers in tailored uniforms, analysts from PSYOPs, senior strategists who spoke in clipped jargon and looked at her like a riddle they couldn't crack. Your broadcast methods, were they improvised? No, she answered calmly. They were planned. You'd prepared for this scenario? She nodded. Alone? Yes. One of them blinked. Why? Madison didn't flinch, because I knew if it ever came to this, no one would believe I could handle it. The word court-martial was never spoken again. Instead, Captain Morrison stood in front of the entire garrison and awarded her the Silver Star. He said the words slowly, carefully, like he was still learning how to say them out loud. Specialist Reeves. You displayed gallantry beyond the expectations of your rank or assignment. You demonstrated not only tactical brilliance, but psychological insight that saved every soldier on this base. Then came the Purple Heart. Torres pinned it to her collar. Himself, I was wrong, he whispered. About everything. Madison didn't answer. She just looked out at the rows of soldiers watching her. Not with pity, not with amusement, but with respect, real. Hard-earned respect. 6 months later, she stood behind a podium instead of a machine gun. The classroom was full of officers, some younger, some older, all curious. The banner behind her read, Advanced Warfare School, Psychological Operations. Division. She clicked the slide. A base schematic appeared. Phoenix. Smoke trails marked every fighting position. Radio logs scrolled beneath. This, she said, is how you break a larger force without firing more than necessary. A young lieutenant raised his hand. And you were alone? She gave the same answer every time. I had a full unit at my back. They just hadn't been born yet. A pause. Then she added, and yes, I was alone. They used to call her Crybaby. Now they called her Instructor Reeves. They studied her strategy at West Point, quoted her in SEOP's manuals. The same voice they once dismissed was now used in simulations to train intelligence officers on emotional pattern recognition. What changed? Nothing, Madison often thought. They just finally learned how to listen. They asked her, months later, if she ever broke. If there was a moment she almost gave up. Madison looked at them, the officers in crisp uniforms, the students scribbling in their notebooks, the reporters eager for drama, and gave them the truth. I broke 100 times that day, she said softly, but never in the way they meant. Because breaking didn't mean failing. Breaking meant your soul bent under the weight and kept moving anyway. They wanted to know how she did it, how she turned tears into strategy, emotion into weaponry, doubt into dominance. But what they really wanted was a blueprint, a guarantee that her kind of strength could be bottled, replicated, assigned. She could tell them about the tactics, the comms trickery, the timing, but that wasn't the core of it. The truth was simpler. She felt everything, and she never let go of that, even when the world told her to. In the halls of military doctrine, she became both anomaly and revolution. They had to rewrite policies because of her. Doctrine had no place for someone like Madison Reeves, a logistics tech with psychological acumen greater than half the brass. On base, she didn't just survive an impossible siege. She inverted every assumption they held about emotion in combat. Now, she was part of a research initiative, the first of its kind. Emotional intelligence in warfare, her mission. Train others to recognize the power of feeling deeply in life or death scenarios. Most combat training focuses on suppressing emotion. She told her students, I trained to function with it, not despite it with it. The class was silent. Even the skeptics were quiet, because they'd read the report. They'd seen the footage. They knew what she'd done, but outside the lecture halls, there were quiet moments when memory returned like shrapnel. A breeze too strong, a thunderclap at the wrong moment, a whiff of cordite in an old munitions depot, and suddenly she was backfiring from position 7, her hands soaked in sweat, hearing the ghost of Peterson's voice crackling in the radio. As she lied through her teeth about phantom air support, back in the bunker where she whispered fake orders into a broken mic, her tears dripping onto the map, convinced it would be the last night of her life. Back in the command post, listening to Morrison tell her she couldn't do it not because he hated her, but because he believed her emotions would get people killed. Those moments still came, and in them, she didn't feel triumphant. She felt human. But then, there were the letters. They arrived from everywhere. A sniper who used to hide his panic behind cruel jokes. A young recruit who'd been told her PTSD made her unfit for the infantry. A mother who'd lost her son in combat, but found comfort knowing someone still felt. They thanked her for proving. That emotional intensity wasn't a curse. It was capacity. That vulnerability wasn't the opposite of strength. It was a different form of it. Madison read every letter, answered most, and kept just one taped inside her locker. It read, "I used to think my tears were weakness. Now I think they're warning lights. Thank you for showing me that." Promotion came, and with it, something she never expected. Command. She hesitated at first. Not because she felt unqualified, but because she knew what came with authority. The same assumptions that once caged her. But her superiors insisted. The new psychological warfare division needed someone who could lead not with intimidation, but with insight. Someone who didn't just understand battlefields, but hearts. She took the post. First order she gave? Anyone caught mocking emotional expression will receive additional training led by me. No one ever joked again. Still, it wasn't medals or titles that mattered most. It was standing on the southern ridge of Verde Valley 6 months later. Alone once more, looking down at the ruins of Forward Operating Base Phoenix, the place where they thought she'd crumble, where her tears had stained the dirt, where every position she'd manned still bore the marks of her presence. 7 nests, 12 positions, 200 invaders, 1 defender, and the valley still remembered. Sometimes others would join her. Like Torres, he'd become her closest ally, once the loudest skeptic. Now her unwavering supporter. "Still can't believe it," he said one afternoon, standing beside her on the ridge. "I can," she replied. He shook his head. "You were right, all along." "No," she said. "I wasn't right. I was just willing to be wrong, loudly and visibly, until the truth proved itself." They stood in silence after that, because sometimes no words were big enough to hold what had happened. The military changed after her, but not fast enough. There were still whispers, still cynics, still people who clung to the old ways, where stoicism was sacred and empathy was dangerous. But now there was room for different kinds of warriors, for those who cried in barracks and still hit their targets, for those who felt too much but never turned away, for those who saw emotion not as noise, but as signal. And it had started with her, with 12 hours, and a woman who refused to become what they needed, so she could become what they never saw coming. The day they placed the medal in her hand, Madison didn't think about glory. She thought about the girl they almost buried, not in the ground, but in silence, in dismissal, in the slow erosion of belief that comes when every room tells you you're too much for this world, too sensitive for battle, too fragile for fire. That girl had died on a sunny Tuesday morning, and in her place stood someone forged in noise flame. An isolation someone who bled and cried and kept going anyway. The medal shone under the auditorium lights, but it wasn't gold that made her feel the weight of what she'd done. It was the silence that followed, the kind of silence reserved, not for show, but for reverence, for understanding. She returned to Phoenix one final time alone. They'd let the base stand as a monument, not to war, but to possibility, the kind born in defiance. In the quiet middle space between rules and reality, the perimeter fences were rusted now, the bunkers hollow, but her marks remained. A dented ammo box in position 4, the melted edge of the Eastern Comms console where she'd faked the airstrike. Call. A bullet casing she'd picked up from the tower floor and carried for 12 hours in her pocket. Rubbing it like a talisman, Madison knelt in the dust, not to pray, but to thank the ground for remembering what everyone else had tried to forget. They used to train soldiers to suppress. Now, they trained them to recognize. Recognize the shaking hands, the tight throat, the flood of grief that sometimes arrived before the blood had even cooled. Recognize that inside the trembling might be insight. Inside the softness, strategy. Inside the tears, clarity. Madison led that training now, not with lectures, but with truth. She'd begin every course with the same question. Who told you that feeling makes you weak? Silence. Then she'd wait. And when someone finally spoke, sometimes hours later, they'd unlock not just memory, but power, and she'd nod. Then let's show them how wrong they were. It wasn't fame she carried. It was proof. Proof that a person could cry through war and still win it. Proof that empathy wasn't a footnote. It was a force. Proof that feeling everything intensely didn't destroy you. It built you. No one asked for her autograph, but they memorized her playbook. Special ops units began integrating psychological modeling into their mission prep. Field medics carried emotional resilience charts. Recruitment officers flagged high-sensitivity applicants, not for disqualification, but for potential. It wasn't perfect, but it was movement. And yet, Madison Reeves never called herself a hero. Not once. She called herself a technician, a strategist, a specialist in things people didn't know could be measured. When asked about that day, she never recounted the kills. She recounted the minutes. 480 of them, each one a breath, a beat, a step further into the unknown. And she told it not to impress, but to remind that courage isn't loud. Sometimes it's silence. Sometimes it trembles. Sometimes it weeps. And sometimes it looks like a lone woman standing in the middle of a battlefield, heart exposed, saying, "Let them come, I'll hold." That was her legacy. Not the medal, not the lectures, not even the rewritten manuals or the doctrine changes. Her legacy was the soldier in week 4 of basic training who wiped tears from her cheeks, steadied her rifle, and whispered, "I fight like her." It was the field operative who paused before an engagement, scanned the terrain, and said, "Check." The psychology first. Remember Reeves. It was the young commander who ordered a recon withdrawal, trusting instinct over protocol, because you felt something wasn't right. And years later, when her name faded from the news and became part of curriculum, one line remained in every textbook. She held the enemy for 12 hours straight alone. Not because she was unafraid, but because she refused to let her feelings sit in silence. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts, and when it does, the whole world learns what true strength really looks like.